that this was a horribly intractable problem, but he took him on anyway. And Kendrew went on to work on myoglobin and ended up solving the first atomic structure of any protein, for which he shared the Nobel Prize in 1962 with Max. But to do that, he had to introduce many novel ideas at the time, and certainly ideas that were unfamiliar to people in biochemistry or biophysics. For example, he was one of the first people to introduce digital computing in crystallography, and he used EDSAC, which was his big mainframe computer in Cambridge, to do all the Fourier synthesis, whereas previously it had been done laboriously by hand. He also investigated multiple species. So he tried a lot of different species of myoglobin before he hit on sperm whale, because it produced good crystals. And even after the structure, he was a pioneer in comparing sequences from different species. So in both computing and in bioinformatics, Kendrew was sort of ahead of his time. And finally, he was a superb science leader and organizer. He helped found EMBO and EMBL. He was the first director of EMBL. He founded and was the editor for many years of the Journal of Molecular Biology, which was highly influential in those days. And he also served as president in his later life of St. John's College in Oxford. So it's fitting that this year's Kendrew Lecture is given by two scientists who've used computational methods to deduce atomic structure of proteins. For several decades, the protein folding problem has been thought of as one of the grand challenges of molecular biology, but progress on it over several decades has been rather gradual. And the structural community was both astonished and excited a couple of years ago when the group at DeepMind used machine learning to top the annual CAPS structure prediction competition by quite a significant margin. And this year, they've greatly expanded both the accuracy and the scope of their structure prediction program. And so we're very delighted, and it's a great pleasure to have the two of the leaders in this effort, Demis Hassabis, who founded DeepMind and indeed thought of this and many other efforts, and John Jumper, who has played a lead role in the AlphaFold effort. The first lecture will be given by Demis Hassabis, who started off as something of a prodigy. He was a chess master at the age of 13. He finished his A-levels when he was 15 or 16 years old, and decided that before going to university, he would take a break and work on designing a number of computer games. He then went on to university in Cambridge, where he graduated in computer science. And after his degree, he continued to work on designing new games, including two of which were nominated for BAFTA. And at some point, he decided perhaps that he didn't want to spend the rest of his life designing games, and decided to get a PhD in cognitive neuroscience at UCL, working with Eleanor McGuire. And my guess, he can tell us if this is true or not, is maybe he thought perhaps understanding the brain more deeply could inspire developments in AI. Around that time, he also spent some time at both MIT and Harvard before continuing as a Henry Wellcome postdoctoral fellow back at UCL. And his work at UCL resulted in a number of highly cited papers, including one showing the connection between amnesia and the ability to imagine new experiences. That is, a connection between memory and imagination, which was cited as one of the 10 breakthroughs of the year by Science magazine. In 2010, after his postdoc, he ignored a suggestion from a very leading and prominent scientist to apply for a Wellcome Career Development Award, and decided to found a company, DeepMind, with two others. And this has turned out to be one of the leading AI companies in the world today. It was acquired by Alphabet, the parent company of Google, in 2014, but remains an autonomous unit within the conglomerate. There was a great deal of publicity a few years ago when they produced a program, AlphaGo, which was able to defeat some of the top players in the world at Go, a game that was previously thought to be too complex for computers. He then went on to lead an effort to create AlphaZero, which was not trained on any human games, but simply taught the rules of the game and was effectively trained itself. And he taught it to play chess and Go and one other game, which I've forgotten. And it turns out that this was even stronger, suggesting that maybe human games were holding the program back. Anyway, my impression is that games, he might have thought of games as a great test bed to test ideas about machine learning, but his long-term focus from my conversations has always been on using AI for real-world problems, including both scientific and medical challenges. So it's a great pleasure to now welcome Demis to talk about using AI to accelerate scientific discovery.
Thanks, Venki, for that great introduction. It's really wonderful to be here. Always wonderful to be back in Cambridge, but also to be in such a auspicious and sort of the cathedral of the molecular biology, the LMB, to be talking about AlphaFold. So it's a great pleasure and honor to be here. So I'm going to discuss a little bit about AlphaFold and how that came to be and about the program itself. But before I do that, I wanted to discuss a little bit about the general AI that we work on that led up to AlphaFold and the thought process behind that. So the title of my lecture is Using AI to Accelerate Scientific Discovery. And for me, as Venki alluded to, this is the whole reason why I spent my entire career working on AI. Even when I was making those computer games, they were all computer games that were based on simulation and AI at the heart. So even at the time, when I was working on those in the 90s, computer games was actually one of the best places to push forward AI research. And that was one of the reasons I was in that field. So at DeepMind, our mission has always been to try and solve intelligence. And by that, I mean fundamentally understand it, the nature of intelligence, and then try and recreate that in an artificial construct, and then use it to advance science for the benefit of humanity. Now, when we talk about building artificial intelligence, sometimes we call it artificial general intelligence to sort of emphasize this notion of generality. We would like an AI system that out of the box can work across a wide range of tasks. And there's been traditionally two sorts of approaches to building AI. The older approach, I guess, a more traditional approach is you can kind of put it under the rubric of expert systems. And the idea here is that you kind of program it directly with the solution. So usually the team of programmers or engineers has solved the problem, then they express it in terms of a set of rules, and then the system effectively executes that set of rules. And the inspiration for these types of expert systems is perhaps mathematics and logic networks and logic systems. And maybe the most famous example of an expert system was Deep Blue, the program that beat Garry Kasparov at chess in the mid-90s. So that's expert systems. On the other hand, you have learning systems. And the idea here is that the AI system learns for itself, and it learns solutions from first principles, so directly from experience or from trial and error. And the other part of learning systems is that they're supposed to generalize to new situations and new tasks. And I think that's what makes them so exciting, is they can potentially solve things that we, as the programmers or the system designers, don't yet know how to solve. So that's the kind of the potential of these kinds of systems to help us in our endeavors. And a lot of the inspiration for some of these learning systems has come from traditionally from neuroscience, systems neuroscience, and also can be validated by looking at how the brain works, for example, with things like reinforcement learning. And at DeepMind, we work on the right-hand side on learning systems. And in fact, the sort of revolution that's happened in AI, the renaissance, if you want to call it, of the last decade or so, has been due to the success at scale of these kinds of learning systems. So what is a learning system? I've just got a little cartoon diagram here of how they work. Here it's particularly reinforcement learning, which is something we specialize in at DeepMind. And reinforcement learning is about a system that learns from first principles through a process of trial and error. So if you see this sort of diagram here, if you think about an agent or the AI system on the left-hand side finds itself in some kind of environment. And that environment could be a real environment, in which case the agent's probably some sort of robot, or it can be a simulated environment like a game, in which case the agent is a kind of avatar, virtual avatar. And the agent gets observations about the environment from its sensory apparatus, right? Usually that's vision, but it can be other modalities as well. And the agent has some sort of goal, usually specified by the designers, which is trying to achieve in the context of that environment. And in this kind of setup, the agent's got two jobs. One is it's got to build a model of the environment and the sort of state space and the transitions in the environment based on the observations. So it's going to obviously be the observations are going to be incomplete, they're going to be noisy, and somehow the agent has to, from that sort of noisy data, has to build a model of the environment. And then once it has a model of the environment, it can use it to make decisions about what it should do next. What actions should it take from the set of actions available to it at that moment that will best get it towards its goal, incrementally towards its goal. And obviously, once the agent has run out of thinking time, it outputs that action, executes the action, that drives a change in the environment, which drives a new observation, and then the agent needs to update its model based on that new observation. So in fact, the agent here is an active participant in its own learning and its own data gathering. So it's a little bit like how a scientist might work. So that's the reinforcement learning setup. It's very simple to explain and show, but it's the complexities underlying this, if you really want to generalize this to artificial general intelligence, are huge in both the model building aspects and the action choosing aspects, and also including the goal specification. All of those things are pretty complex topics in themselves. But we know this works because this is how the brain works, and primate brains use reinforcement learning, temporal difference learning, in order to learn about their environments. So we know in the limit that this should be this should be enough to drive artificial general intelligence. Now, the most famous example, sort of prominent example of this working at scale, this type of reinforcement learning system, is, as Venki mentioned, AlphaGo, which was our program about 5 years ago now to beat the world champion at the game of Go. Now, this is the game of Go. For those of you who don't know, it's amazing game, 3,000 years old. It's what they play in Asia, in China, Japan, Korea, instead of chess. Sort of occupies that intellectual echelon, but it's actually much more complex than chess, and it's much more about pattern matching than chess is, which is more about calculation. And this is the reason why Go has been so hard for computers to play. So you can think of chess was sort of solved, well, not solved, but cracked in the mid-90s, when Deep Blue beat Kasparov with these sort of massive rules-based expert systems. But that type of approach has never worked with Go. You can't even be a professional player, let alone a world champion, even 20 years after Deep Blue, with that type of expert system approach. And the reason is twofold. One is that the search space is absolutely enormous in Go. So there are 10 to the 170 possible positions in Go on the 19 by 19 board, which is more than the atoms in the universe. So obviously some kind of brute force approach is not going to work, not going to scale. And the other thing is, probably even harder, is the fact that it's impossible to, or proven to be impossible, very difficult to write down an evaluation function. An evaluation function that will tell the system whether a position is good or not good. and how to rate a certain position. And obviously that's critical in allowing the AI system to decide what to do, which move to choose. And because Go is so esoteric, unlike chess, which relies on material and other things, it's actually very difficult to encapsulate the dynamics of the game as a set of rules. And so one might think, well, how do the top human players deal with this complexity? Well, actually, if you talk to the top Go players in the world, they tell you about a move felt right or it looked right. So they use they use their intuition. They rely heavily on their intuition and pattern matching rather than calculation. Often, if you ask a chess grandmaster why did they make a particular move, they'll have an explicit plan they can tell you that they were after. In Go, it's very different from that. It's much more intuitive. And that's not a word that we normally associate with computers, this kind of intuitive capability. So what we did instead is, instead of trying to write down an evaluation function, a set of rules to allow the computer to evaluate the position, we instead learned one. We got AlphaGo to learn for itself what was good about positions and learn for itself about Go. So how did we do that? Well, we trained a neural network to play against itself millions of times and to learn through that process of self-play how to evaluate position and also how to pick probable likely moves to look at in the current position. And the way we did that is, this is a incremental process. So if you imagine the version 1 of AlphaGo maybe plays tens of thousands of games against itself, starts off completely randomly, playing completely randomly. That generates a set of data. So you can think of all those games it's played as data. And then we train a second version of the neural network, version 2, which is learning things from that data set, like how to predict who the winner is going to be from a certain position and what sorts of moves are played in certain positions. And then what we do is we have a little mini tournament where the version 2 plays the version 1 in a kind of like 100-game match-off. And if it wins 55% of the time, kind of a threshold rate, we replace V1 with this version 2 of the system. If it loses or it doesn't cross this 55% win threshold, we carry on generating more data with the V1 version, right? And then we have 200,000 games to train a new version 2. And then it tries again to beat version 1. So at some point, version 2 does beat version 1. Then we replace the master system. It is now version 2. That now generates a new set of data. So that plays against itself 100,000 times, a new higher quality data set. That's then used to train version 3, which in turn plays against version 2, and so on and so forth. And after about 17, 18 generations of this, you get to world champion level, just from bootstrapping from random play. So this is the kind of, you can think of this as building the model about the environment, in this case, Go. And now what we can do with that is combine that model, the neural network, with a type of search function. In this case, for Go, we use Monte Carlo tree search. So if you imagine this is the tree of all possibilities from a Go position, 10 to the 170 possible positions, obviously branching factor of 100 or so per move. So this tree quickly gets massive. And what the neural network does is it guides the tree search so that it doesn't have to consider all possibilities, which obviously be intractable, but just the most probable, most valuable ones. So you can think of what the neural network does, the model, is it limits the search to just like maybe these blue paths, right? A fraction actually of the total space, and actually much less than the traditional expert systems generally look through. So orders of magnitude less positions. So it's a little bit more like how a human player would evaluate a position. And then finally, it can then use the tree search to then figure out what's the best path out of those probable paths, those promising paths, which is here in pink. So we then went on to have this sort of famous $1 million challenge match with Lee Sedol, who's the 18-time world champion and a sort of legend of the game, considered one of the greatest players of all time. And we played it in Seoul. The whole of Korea sort of came to standstill, 200 million viewers. And AlphaGo won 4-1. And this was sort of proclaimed to be a decade before its time by both the Go fraternity and the AI fraternity. So both were pretty shocked by this turn of events. And but it wasn't so much just that AlphaGo won the match, it was also how it won. And in fact, it turned out that AlphaGo came up with original strategies that had never been thought by human players before, even though this has been played for thousands of years and professionally for hundreds of years. And this most famously happened in game 2 of this 5-game match. And it's move 37, which has now gone down in Go legend and has been sort of studied ever since the match. And it's this move here on the right-hand side, which I won't go into the reasons why this was such a crazy, unthinkable move. But it's basically, this is an early part of the game, and you're not supposed to play on the 5th line. It's sort of unthinkable to do that in this kind of position. And that's what AlphaGo did. And turns out 100 moves later, that stone, that move 37, was in exactly the right place to win AlphaGo the match, almost as if it presciently had sort of put it there. So this has sort of been studied. And if you're interested in that and about AlphaGo, I can recommend the sort of award-winning documentary about it, which talks through the whole story of how the Go world reacted to this and the new ideas that came about because of that. So that's games. And as Venki was alluding to and guessed correctly, the reason we work on games initially at DeepMind, we still do now, is that they are the perfect training ground for AI methods and developing them and testing them. Really efficient to use. You can simulate millions of these game simulations in parallel on the cloud, and they're very convenient because they usually have a very easily specifiable goal, right? To win the game or to maximize the points, something like that. So it's quite easy to generate the right test conditions for AI. So, but that's, of course, not the purpose of what we're doing at DeepMind. Games are fun. I love games. I've worked on them my whole life, but they're just a means to an end in the sense of once we had developed what we thought were general enough and powerful enough learning algorithms, then we wanted to apply them to real world problems, to grand challenges, and especially in the area of science, which is my personal passion and why I've worked on AI my whole life. And so what's really amazing now is finally, after a decade of hard work and development, I think we're ready now to see a flourishing of applications of these types of AI systems to scientific discovery itself. So what do we look for in a problem? And this is half the battle, as you all know, as scientists, is picking the right question. So how do we go about that at DeepMind? Well, and I'm continuing on the lookout for these types of problems that fit these criteria. So first of all, we love problems that have massive combinatorial search spaces or state spaces. And the reason we love that is because what that means is that exhaustive brute force methods, more kind of brute force methods, won't work. Right, they just won't be tractable in that kind of situation. Secondly, we look for problems that have clear objective functions or clear metrics that we can optimize against. That's very important for our learning systems to have something to optimize against. And then third, we either need quite a lot of data or an accurate and efficient simulator. Because if we have a simulator, even if it's noisy, as long as there's some signal in that, we can generate more data ourselves using compute. So if those three things hold, usually that is a suitable problem for our techniques, learning techniques, AI techniques. And surprisingly, it turns out when you start looking for things with this lens, there are lots of problems in science and also other real world applications that actually fit these criteria. The one obviously I'm going to talk about today is protein folding, which actually ticks all of those boxes very well, and hence was one of the first things we turned our attention to straight after AlphaGo. Of course, as you all know, the protein folding problem is the problem of going from an amino acid sequence. You can think of it as like a one-dimensional string array of letters into the 3D protein structure. How can we go from this 1D structure and predict the 3D structure from it? Of course, as you'll be aware as well, that Anfinsen, famously in 1972, his Nobel Prize lecture, sort of conjectured that the three-dimensional structure of a native protein should be fully determinable by the amino acid sequence. So this sort of set off then a 50-year grand challenge in biology to see if this was possible to do. Of course, opposed against that was Leventhal and his sort of paradox that he mentioned, which is that, you know, he calculated that for an average protein, there might be something like 10 to the 300 possible conformations. So obviously, if you were to sort of exhaustively try to sample this, say 1 per second, that would be totally intractable, longer than, you know, the age of the universe. And so, but yet, and this is the paradox, obviously nature and physics somehow folds these proteins spontaneously, often within milliseconds. So the big question then is, can the protein structure prediction problem be solved computationally in a tractable way? So my particular journey on this actually started long before even DeepMind. So I first came across the problem as an undergrad, actually, you know, here at Cambridge, at Queen's. It's a funny story because the person who told me about this is actually in the audience today, Tim Stevens, who's actually at the LMB. He was in my year at Queen's, and he was obsessed with that problem even back then. And at least as I remember it, used to tell everyone at every available moment in the bars about how important and foundational this problem was. And it sort of stuck with me actually for a long time. And I kind of filed that away. And then later on, about 10, 15 years later, I came across this again when I was doing my postdoc at MIT, when I came across the Foldit game. And of course, the Foldit is a citizen science game, probably still one of the best examples of that, of getting amateurs, gamers really, to try and fold proteins and turning it into a kind of fun puzzle game. And this, of course, has caught my interest with my background in games and science. And I still think it's a fascinating idea, this idea of citizen science, people playing games, but actually it turns out they're doing something useful for science. And what was intriguing was that the best players were able to fold real structures. And I think there was a couple of quite famous, I think even a Nature paper, where some players did find some new structure using the game. And that was another important piece of the puzzle, because I thought, well, that's interesting that, you know, they used to bend the backbone as like a move and things like that. And sometimes they would have to do counterintuitive moves, at least from an energetic perspective, to actually get to the right conformation. So somehow these amateur biologists, I guess professional gamers maybe they were able to use their intuition to pick the right move, so to speak. And that made me think, as we started solving Go, you know, perhaps this is somewhat analogous to the intuition that the Go masters were using and telling me about the way that they picked the moves they were going to move in the middle of a Go game. So if we were able to mimic the Go players' intuition with AlphaGo, why could we not mimic these Foldit players' intuition too? So that was one aspect that made me think this was tractable. And then the other important piece of the puzzle was CASP, which is the competition that's run every 2 years since 1994. It's regarded as the gold standard for protein folding. And it's really important, actually, when you go after a problem, that there are these external independent benchmarks that you can benchmark your internal progress against. Obviously, in games, you can test it against the best human players in the world to see where you're at. And in CASP, there's this amazing competition that is a blind prediction assessment. So, you know, you get usually about 100 proteins for each competition, but those structures are not known. That's the critical thing. They have not been published yet. They're not known at the time of the test. They're only revealed after the competition ends. So there's no way you can sort of overfit or anything else to these structures, even by accident. And I just want to give a shout out to John Molt, and who's the founder of this, and the CASP organizers who've been running this for so many years now, nearly 3 decades, and they do an incredible job of that. And it's an amazingly well-run competition. And I actually think this kind of external benchmark could be very useful in other areas of science if it was to be replicated. So what has had happened at CASP historically? Well, actually, if you see from this bar here, for the sort of the decade between 2006 and 2016, there hadn't been a lot of progress. Progress was pretty limited, and this is the GDT score for the hardest category, the free modeling category, where there's no templates and other things. And you can see the scores more or less has not improved very much. I mean, the competition has got harder over each year, so there's been a little bit of improvement, but not a huge amount. And then what happened is we came sort of along in 2018 for the CAS 13 competition, was the first one we entered, and I think we were the first to sort of introduce the use of ML as the core component and at scale. And this, AlphaFold 1 won the competition by quite a large margin, and we improved accuracies on the hardest category here, free modeling, by close to 50%. So it was a really big jump in performance. And if you want to, if you're interested in the details of that particular system, you can check out our paper from 2020 that describes that in detail. Then for the months afterwards, we tried to push this system further, but we sort of reached the ceiling of the performance, and we realized that we needed to go back to the drawing board, take the knowledge and the know-how we'd learned from AlphaFold 1 and completely re-architect the system. And that's what we entered as AlphaFold 2 in the CAS 14 competition last summer, the 2020 edition, and that then finally reached this threshold of atomic accuracy. So these were the results from the 2020 competition, from CAS 14. The magic threshold that we were told by John Molt and others of the organizers was less than 1 angstrom error, more or less the width of an atom. And that was the key threshold that was felt to be competitive with experimental methods and therefore would maybe be useful in practice, widely useful in practice. And AlphaFold 2 achieved a 0.96 angstrom error and was around 3 times better than the next best system in CAS 14, even though obviously those systems were incorporating our ideas from the CAS 13 competition. So it was again by a very large margin, and the new changes that we'd introduced. Here's some example predictions, really interesting proteins that we were getting over 90 GDT score on. And even as you see on the left-hand side there, from the SARS-CoV, the side chains often as well in the correct positions, or very nearly the correct positions. Now, this is the AlphaFold 2 architecture. It's a pretty complex architecture. I'm not going to go into it today because John is going to cover that in more detail in his talk, so I'll leave that to him. But the key advances that are worth thinking about is that, and sort of noting, this is probably the most complex system we have ever built. And we built some pretty complicated systems at DeepMind. And one measure of that is like there's 32 component algorithms. In the methods paper, there's 60 pages of SI supplementary information, which is just an indication of the complexity involved. And what I would say is there was no sort of single silver bullet, but actually a host of insights and innovations were needed, and then carefully and sort of cleverly integrated together in order to crack this problem. And the 3 main things that were sort of advances over the CAS 13 system was, firstly, this was an end-to-end system with an iterative recycling stage that allowed the structure to sort of be refined with each stage. AlphaFold 1 was not end-to-end, produced a histogram, and then we had to have a gradient descent module that actually created the structure. And what we found in machine learning is the more end-to-end you can make things, the better, and let it directly optimize that, what you're actually after, in this case, the structure. We changed from convolutional neural networks to attention-based neural network that then inferred the implicit graph structure between the residues. And then probably the most key thing was how to build in evolutionary and physics constraints, things about the local geometry, for example, into the architecture, the neural network architecture, but without impacting the learning. And that's a real challenge in machine learning, is how to bring to bear prior knowledge that you have about a domain, and bringing those constraints in a useful way that doesn't end up impacting and holding back the learning. So another just thing to note about is that this has been actually probably our biggest research effort so far. It's taken over 5 years, roughly with about 20 people, and it needed a very multidisciplinary team. So of course we have machine learning and engineering, but actually biologists, chemists, and physicists all in the mix here to actually solve this problem. And then maybe one final point to make is usually at DeepMind, when we're working on machine learning, we're very interested in the idea of generality, right? So when we're testing our systems on games, we don't want to overfit to that game itself. We want to build systems that are very general. So for example, with the AlphaGo system I showed you, we ended up developing that into AlphaZero, which could play any 2-player game. And it didn't need any human data. So it could play Go and chess and Japanese chess and so on. And one system was able to do that. And that's what we're after because we're after building artificial general intelligence. But when you're trying to solve an applied problem, an app which has use in of itself, like AlphaFold, downstream use, then actually what we do there is take all of our know-how and throw everything we have at it, including domain knowledge, right? It's no holds barred. Like we're not going to just limit ourselves to general purpose systems and general techniques that can generalize to other areas. We actually just care about solving this problem with everything we've got. So we really threw everything we had, all our know-how, all of our ideas at this problem. And generality is sort of secondary. Having said that, we will go back. Generally, what we do is AI is a sort of, I call it an engineering science, because before you can inspect it scientifically, you have to build it first, the artifact first. So unlike a natural science where the phenomenon already exists, you have to actually build it first. So what we found is the best way to get to generality is to solve the problem first, like with AlphaGo, and then take modules out and see what was actually necessary for the performance. And then that way you get a more general system. So that's still to come for things like AlphaFold, is to see what aspects of that were needed. And John, again, will talk about that in his talk. So one other thing I want to mention is about speed and scale. So again, the way we try to tackle these problems is focus first on performance. Can you actually crack the problem? In this case, get to an error of less than 1 angstrom. And then afterwards, once you've reached that threshold, then you worry about optimizing your system and making it as efficient as possible. So AlphaFold 2 now is extremely fast. It uses a very moderate amount of compute by modern machine learning standards. So training takes about 2 weeks on 8 TPU chips, which is equivalent to about 150 GPUs. And so this isn't really a story about massive compute. It's actually was the algorithmic advances that were the critical things here. And then the inference, so actually coming up with the structures extremely fast. So it now takes, order of minutes for an average size protein on a single GPU. So when we started seeing these speeds, around late last year, we were starting to think about also how would we give broad access to these predictions? What would be the right way to do that for the research community, for all of you to use? And the traditional way in this field is to say maybe stand up a server, and then you could submit your sequence you're interested in, and then we give you back the server would give you back that structure. But what we realized when we did back of envelope calculations on this is that the entire proteomes now were within reach. And so rather than stand up a server and a service, we should just fold everything and then put it out there for everyone to use. So that's when we started thinking about proteome scale things and then starting with the human proteome. So the first thing we did was run that. We did the first version of that, I think, over Christmas when a lot of the machines were available. And we did the 20,000 proteins. One of the things I love about AI is that while you're having your Christmas lunch, it can be doing work for you. I've always thought that's fascinating about computers and machines and AI specifically. So all the 20,000 proteins are expressed by the human genome. Experimental coverage, as all of you will know, was about 17%. And then we more than doubled that to 36% with very high accuracy confidence and 58% at what we would call high accuracy, and including some interesting insights into proteins that may be unstructured in isolation or disordered. And John will talk a little bit more about that disordered proteins in his talk. So we think this is the sort of most complete and accurate picture of the human proteome ever. Now, what do I mean by those measures? What I just mentioned by very high accuracy and high accuracy. Well, one of the important things about this model that was critical for this model is an output of its own confidence in its predictions. So measures of uncertainty are not that common, I would say, in machine learning models. They're sort of like a nice to have, like everyone talks about them, and they would be good if they generated them. But a lot of machine learning models don't do that. But we thought it was critical here, actually, given that we wanted this to be used downstream and relied upon by experimental biologists. It was important for them to be able to interpret the results in some sort of simple way, like which aspects of these predictions could be relied on, and then therefore how they should interpret their experiments that they're going to build on top of that. So we felt this was not a nice to have in this case; it was an essential. And so what we went ahead and did was we trained AlphaFold to, in addition to producing the structures, to also output a per residue confidence metric, which we call PLDDT. And there's sort of three thresholds that are relevant here. The above 90, we consider to be very high accuracy. And what that means is that the side chains we believe are quite reliable as well. And potentially it's sort of comparable or competitive with experiment. The next threshold down, which we call high accuracy, is sort of greater than 70. We color it in this sort of light blue. So dark blue is over 90, light blue is over 70. And there, what we would say is that the backbone is probably reliable. So, and so that could still be of use for some applications. And then interestingly, below 50, we sort of say it's a very low confidence prediction. And it turns out the early sort of evidence suggests that this may actually be a good predictor of disorder or unstructured in isolation. So it may actually be telling us something about the underlying biology. We didn't make a strong claim in the papers because it was very early days. We just sort of kind of did some basic analysis on it, and it looked like it was trending in the right direction. But since we've released the papers, we've had some people, experts in disorder, contact us, and it seems to be holding up. So more research is needed, and we're doing some collaborations on this to see if this is how reliable this is. But it certainly seems promising that it could be thought of as a disorder predictor. So we didn't just stop at human proteome. We thought we might as well fold another 20 model organisms and proteomes. We tried to choose ones that were, be maximally useful to the research community. So a bunch of model organisms, things like fruit fly, E. coli, the mouse, C. elegans, zebrafish, and so on, and yeast. Other research species, pathogens like malaria, and so on, and then some crop species as well. Made it into the top 20. And obviously we are in the process of expanding that. And then we thought about the accessibility of this. So we had all these proteomes. How are we going to sort of structure these databases? And we've had a wonderful collaboration with the European Bioinformatics Institute just around the corner, EMBL EBI, who are the world's leading experts in providing databases for the scientific community. And we thought rather than creating our own thing, we should just plug into the main vein of biological tools and then and build this database with them and their expertise and tooling and how to do this in the right way, and that scientists will be used to already in their workflow, and provide a free and unrestricted access to every structure for any use case. And that, along with us open sourcing all the code, we felt was in this case the best way to maximize the scientific impact and benefit to the research community. And it's been really heartening to get all the feedback from experimenters about how this has been useful to them. And even today in lunch and other meetings, hearing how you're all using AlphaFold, and I'd love to hear more stories about how that's helping you in your work. So then finally, what are we planning next? Well, over the next year, we plan to fold every protein, or almost every protein, let's say, in UniProt. So it's going to be over 100 million proteins. It's a big job, and also to quality control that. So we're sort of scaling even our scaled up version to attempt to do this. But that's very exciting. And then future work, I'm very interested in, we're sort of very interested in protein complexes, disordered proteins, point mutations, ligand docking, and protein design. And that's just a sample of many of these projects we're already working on, and some we're just starting up with collaborations. Actually, John's going to talk about a couple of these a lot more in his talk. So overall, what we're trying to do is, of course, we've done the sort of static structure prediction here with AlphaFold 2, and that's great and really useful, hopefully. But we want to eventually work our way towards understanding function and trying to do as much of that computation as possible. And some of these things will help us get towards that and understanding the dynamics and the physics of what's going on with proteins. So I just want to end by maybe a couple of more philosophical ideas, if you like. I think the more I've looked into biology the last few years, especially obviously with the whole AlphaFold project, I've always been fascinated by biology. And I think at its most fundamental level, at least the way I think about it, it's an information processing system, albeit an organic one. And I think that there's a lot of kind of isomorphisms between those two things, like information processing and computer science and biology in that respect. But the thing is, obviously, life is phenomenally complex and emergent process, sort of the emergent property of countless interactions, tons of weak signals. So I think it's sort of too complex, actually, to describe purely mathematically. One of the ways I say that is sort of, is there going to be the equivalent of Newton's laws of motion for a cell? I find that hard to believe because it's just such a complex interactive system. But I think that AI might be the perfect sort of tool to understand that kind of regime. It's a sort of perfect regime for AI in many ways. And I think of it as just like maths is the sort of right description language for physics. I think AI might turn out to be just the right level of description language for biology. And I think AlphaFold, I hope, is a sort of first proof of concept of that. And, maybe sort of heralds the beginning of a new era of what I'm calling sort of digital biology. And, the dream at some point maybe would be to scale up to one day something like a virtual cell. And then just in terms of, just to finish off with my sort of the title of my talk, there are actually many other fields that we're working in, not as mature as what we've done with AlphaFold, but we've had some major breakthroughs this year on each of these fields: quantum chemistry, pure mathematics, medical diagnosis, material design, and actually some other topics too, things like weather forecasting. And they'll be coming out later this year, early next year. And I really believe that it is a kind of a new amazing tool for science, and can impact all sorts of areas of science that satisfy those three criteria I mentioned earlier in the talk. And if you think of it that way, I think of AI, it's a bit like the Hubble telescope for cosmologists, that allows them to see further into the cosmos. I see AI as a sort of ultimate tool in a way to help us as scientists see further into our domains. So I just want to end by thanking the PDB and all of you who are experimentalists, experimental community, obviously all the amazing work that's been done here, starting with John Kendrew and people like him, which we couldn't have done without all of that data. We wouldn't have been able to build AlphaFold. And I just want to thank everyone who made AlphaFold possible, both the methods group and the human proteome group. Obviously, there's quite a few people overlapping in both of those two groups. The wider team at DeepMind, all of our machine learning expertise we have around us at DeepMind to help, the collaborators at EMBL EBI, the CAS community, and the experimental biology community. Thanks for listening.
Well, thank you very much. That was a fascinating talk. So we have a few minutes for questions. So I'll take a couple of questions. So Roger.
It's really incredible what
Could you actually wait for the microphone, because otherwise the online audience won't be able to hear.
It's really impressive what AlphaFold. It's really impressive what it's accomplished, but there are also some amazingly dumb things. when you look at predictions, you can see domains that you've known the structure for 20 years that are completely unreliably predicted. I mean, not even close to what they actually are. I mean, the simplest algorithm of saying, is it homologous to anything with a known structure would have gotten it right. And yet AlphaFold is completely wrong. Do you have a way to learn from these things?
Yeah, so we try and incorporate templates and things like that into the learning system and there's the inputs. It will happen from time to time. I mean, it's a learning system. So we're trying to analyze it ourselves, like why it's doing certain things. And you can think of it, I'll give you an analogy with AlphaGo. When we got it to be the world champions and everything, every now and again, like in game 4, the one that he won, it would start sort of evaluating positions wrongly. And sometimes they weren't even the most complex positions. Sometimes there'd be some simpler motif. Why can't it understand that motif? And you can think of it as a bit like a bug. But the problem with these bugs is it's a bug in its knowledge. So it's different from a normal bug in a software system. You go in and debug it and add some new if-then statement and say, oh, look up the homolog, right? But if you do that, then what about the situations? How does it balance that against what it's learned? Right, so that's the difficulty, and also I mentioned about the constraints we put in. That's already quite hard, although it learns on top of that. If you do hard-coded things like that, it can damage it in a different situation. So we'd love though to hear feedback from all of you of things that it's not doing properly. And then what we would generally do, and while we were talking to various people at lunch today about that, is the next stage is to create a test set of dumb things. Right, and we used to call it a shoe code test set for Go, where there was like initially 100 positions. It turned out to be 1,000 positions, where AlphaGo in that case would do really stupid things. And so what we asked the new versions of AlphaGo to do was not just beat themselves previously on the normal metrics, winning the game and everything, but also they'd have to hill climb and do better on that specific test set, held out test set. And once we did that, we got to about 99% on those test positions. It seemed to solve this sort of knowledge gap, so to speak. So I think we're going to need to do something like that with AlphaFold. And we really need the help of the experimental community to do that, because we're not experts in all the different proteins like you all are. So if you see something that's, dumb like that, please email it to us. I think there's an email on the bottom of our database for feedback, and tell us, look, this thing, it shouldn't do it. Here's the homolog, why it's doing it. And we'll put it in our test set. And then AlphaFold 3 will hopefully, our next version will hopefully have fixed a lot of those problems. Yeah.
Good.
Hey, Dennis. Have any of your team looked at using your models to bootstrap full physics dynamic simulations of proteins, maybe sort of using your confidence scores as restraint somehow, letting the rest float?
Yeah, we are working on those kinds of things now and sort of trying to, that's the next phase. And we need a whole new type of system probably to try and understand the physics of what's going on versus just translate, the sequence to the structure. And we haven't got any, results to talk about yet, but there's some promising things. We've got to get back to using that physics approach back to the level AlphaFold is. And then from there, we might see some improvements or at least extensions of what these systems can do to the dynamics and interactions and binding affinities, all of these things that, you probably have to understand a bit about the physics or more about the physics than AlphaFold 2 implicitly understands anyway.
Yeah. Naturally, it would be nice to get an ensemble of structural models out rather than just a single one.
Yeah, different conformations, and then if something binds to them, they change. Yeah, exactly. We're thinking about all these misfolded proteins. Almost like you want to say, what's the most likely fold, and then some of the secondary, folds energetically, these kinds of things. We're not able to do that yet, but we have to go a bit further with understanding the physics, I think, in order to do that properly.
Any more questions here? Okay.
Hey, Dennis, thanks very much. So you said that your mission and motivation was always kind of to contribute to science. I was wondering if you could give us the main reasons why you decided to, very consciously decided to pursue that in a commercial setting, in a company, rather than trying to pursue an academic career that could also have maybe achieved these things. And
yeah,
I hope the answer doesn't give too many sleepless nights in this audience.
Yeah. Well, look, a DeepMind is a hybrid organization. We've tried to consciously blend the best from academia and the kind of blue sky thinking and ambitious thinking we have in the best places, like best institutes like this place, and long-term thinking, let's say, which often doesn't happen in companies, and then blend that with the best from startups. So the energy, the pace, and the focus and the organization that the best startups have. And then we sort of combine that with a third thing, which is Alphabet resources. And so that's one of the reasons we teamed up with them, is we needed, the compute power, so that not only to train individual systems, but also to do experiments. For us, our workbench is computers, right? That's how we try out our ideas and get results and then improve. So all of those factors made it, for me at least, easier to do that in a commercial setting, or in theory. I mean, it's not a normal commercial setting. Let's put it that way. We don't have to worry about short-term profitability, things like that, which would really impact your long-term research programs. And I think that's the thing. That's what goes wrong a lot with industrial research labs, is they get pulled around too short-term by product requirements. And I've always tried to insulate DeepMind from that. And then you get things like AlphaFold and AlphaGo if you're patient enough and you have the right setup. So I just think for this particular thing we needed, which was computers, that was the right setup for that. But for other big projects, it may not be the case. But for us, I think it accelerated us by 5+ years, us combining with those resources. We're not idea constrained, right? And then the other thing I'd mention is, in academia, it's difficult to get permanent positions for engineers, top level engineers, not just scientists. And I think that's a perennial structural problem with science. Like, what's the career path for the top engineers? We actually created a whole new job kind of description called research engineers. That's this sort of combination of amazing engineering jobs, but also some research skills. And these research engineers are sort of key to scaling a lot of this stuff up and making it work. But it's very difficult to see how you would get that funded in traditional lab models.
We'll take a couple of questions from the online viewers. So one of them, Mark Durr asks, Chris Boter asks, are there any plans to apply DeepMind approaches to general problems in nonlinear physics, like turbulence or shear flow?
Yes. We are actually exactly looking at that. One of the things we're doing, which I haven't really announced yet, but maybe I can talk a little about it, is looking at things like plasma containment in fusion reactors. So for sure, I think AI systems are going to be right for that. There's also predicting the weather, which is a very non-linear physics system. Like the rainfall, we just published a paper on that, which is the most accurate prediction of rainfall in the next 2 hours, which is quite relevant for the UK. And we did that with the Met Office, and it's better than any of their obviously very sophisticated weather models they have. And I feel that we can scale that up maybe to climate models and other things. So I think that's a very fruitful area, actually.
Then there's a question from Felix Dingler from the MRC WIM at Oxford, which says, you mentioned the input of subject matter expertise, but what about output? How much do you believe we have to enjoy AI on the strength of its performance as a deus ex machina? Are there human interpretable lessons on protein folding that you can glean from this? I think there's a general problem.
Yes.
That AI is a black box, and how do you learn principles?
So I think it's sort of twofold, that question. I kind of touched on it in my talk, which was that if the outputs in themselves are really useful, then that make use of that. And I think that's totally valuable in itself. So I would say that's the case with AlphaFold. I mean, imagine you found a cure for cancer. I don't think you'd be quibbling about how the machine necessarily came up with that idea. We would just use it in medicine. On the other hand, if we want to look, we also, of course, as scientists, we're interested in mechanisms and underlying mechanisms. So we are currently working, we have a whole research group that works on analytic tools to kind of break down what these systems are doing. Actually, John's going to talk about what we mentioned in our methods paper about all the ablation. We did a very careful ablation studies to ablate every part of the system and see what mattered. Turns out all of it mattered. Is the sort of to cutting to the point, but to different degrees. And then the other thing we'd like to understand is the representations they build, and these intermediate representations. What do they actually represent in the real world domain? And I would say that the analytic tool community is quite nascent relative to the performance engineering. And I think it's obviously going to lag by 5 years or so, because you've got to build impressive systems that are worth even studying and taking apart. And then it takes several years to understand that system in the same way it takes years to understand any natural phenomena. They're just as complex, these artificial systems, as biological systems. Perhaps we're in a slightly easier regime because they're digital, so we can pull them apart more easily. But yeah, we're going to have to come with new analysis techniques, I think, to look inside these black boxes.
Okay, since it's 3:30, it's time for our break. So thank you very much, Dennis, for that.